The transcendental idealism is the key to the revelation of all secrets of the whole system of the world. Immanuel Kant. In my two last lectures, I talked about Kant's critical project. I talked about how criticism is his answer to the conflict between dogmatism on the one side, with its blind faith in our reason's ability to answer metaphysical questions like the question for God, for the immortality of the soul, for freedom. And on the other side, skepticism with its blind doubt that our reason can answer these questions. I explained how Kant wants to take a critical look at our reason, at our cognition, and thereby find out what it can do, what the sources and the extent and the limits of its abilities are, and what it can't do. And then in the last lecture, I explained what the big question of Kant's critical project is. That is the question how synthetic judgments a priori, that is, judgments that extend our knowledge and don't just explain things we already know, don't just explain concepts we already have, but rather extend our knowledge, but that are not based in experience. So they are not extending our knowledge by using experience, but only through pure reasoning. How such judgments are possible. Because once we know how they are possible, once we know what the condition for such a synthetic judgment a priori is, then we can know if a specific question, a specific inquiry, like the question for God, if that meets these criteria and therefore can be answered, or doesn't meet them and therefore can't be answered. Now, both dogmatism and skepticism, both are united in that they think about objects. That is something else, something that is not me, the thinker, but another thing that I think about. Dogmatism says we can have knowledge about the object, and skepticism says no, we can't have knowledge about the object. But both are trying to look at the object. What Kant is doing with his critical turn is he instead is looking at the thinking subject. And thereby Kant created a whole new type of philosophy, and that is transcendental philosophy, as a philosophy about the conditions of the possibility of cognition out of pure reason. You could say that all regular thinking, no matter if it's the common thinking or if it's scientific thinking, all regular thinking is thinking about objects. It is always a subject trying to find out something about the object. And of course, you can objectify the subject like you do in certain sciences, like you do in psychology or anthropology, where you look at the human being, but in that case, you don't look at the human being as a subject, you look at it as you look at other objects. So, like the biologist looks at other animal species, He may also look at the human as an animal species, but then he doesn't really treat the human as a subject. What transcendental philosophy does is to really look at the subject as a subject. So, as the thinker, as the knower. And therefore, maybe it's better to not speak of the subject here, because by using a noun like that, it still sounds like we are talking about an object, like we are talking about the thing, the subject. Maybe it would be better to say that all the other thinking is the thinking about objects, and all the other sciences are thinking about objects. In what Kant calls applied philosophy, that is in natural science, we are thinking about objects that experience gives to us, like matter, the planets and their movements, animals, whatever. And in pure philosophy, that is in metaphysics, and you can look back at my lecture on what is metaphysics to Kant. In pure philosophy, we are thinking about objects that are not given to us by experience, but objects that we come up with ourselves, like God or freedom. But nevertheless, in both cases, we are thinking about objects. Well, transcendental philosophy is not a thinking about objects, but it is a thinking about the thinking of objects. What do we do when we think objects? Transcendental philosophy is reason not examining other things, but examining itself. So, in a way, you could say that transcendental philosophy is a metaphysics. It is the peak of all philosophy, because here we are looking at the very conditions of doing philosophy. We are taking a step back, so to say, from our normal thinking, even if that normal thinking is scientific, and we are asking what is behind that thinking, what are the sources and the conditions of that thinking. And that makes transcendental philosophy a sort of propedeutics. Kant, and I already mentioned that in my lecture on what is philosophy to him, Kant compares it in a way with logic. He says that logic has the role of being a propedeutics to science. So Kant said that when the students come to university and start studying there, logic should be the entrance through which they pass. And then transcendental philosophy is the propedeutics to metaphysics. So the common intellect should pass through logic to become a scientific intellect, and the scientific intellect should pass through transcendental philosophy before it does metaphysics. But there's also a sharp difference between transcendental philosophy and logic, because logic, Kant says, is purely formal. It just deals with the formal laws of our cognition. Like, for example, the principle of contradiction, which says that our statements, must not contradict themselves. but logic doesn't care about the actual content of our statements. Transcendental philosophy, on the other hand, is material. It does care about the content of our thinking. It deals with the very fundamental and basic elements of our thinking, the basic concepts of pure reason on which all our thinking is based, and by which we always and with necessity think. But that is the big turn and in Kant's philosophy. He is stressing that transcendental philosophy is not talking about the way the things, the objects in the world necessarily are, because we can't know anything about the things in themselves. I talked about this in my previous lecture on the question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? But rather, transcendental philosophy talks about how do we necessarily think about the objects. Not how they necessarily are in themselves, but how they necessarily appear to us because we have to think them in that way. So, for example, in previous metaphysics, they try to prove God. There's the so-called ontological proof for God, which tries to prove that God is necessary. And to that, the transcendental philosophy of Kant replies that indeed it is necessary for us to think of God. It is a necessary idea of our reason. But that doesn't mean that the object of this idea, that is God, is necessary in itself. It only means that the thought of God is necessary. That is the turn that Kant does. Recognizing that we cannot talk about what is necessary in the world outside of us, what is necessary in the objects. We can only talk about what is necessary in our own thinking. Very often you will hear that the very name transcendental philosophy comes from Kant. That is, however, wrong. The name, the term transcendental philosophy was already in use in the 18th century, even before Kant. It was sometimes used as a synonym for ontology. I talked in my lecture what is metaphysics to Kant. I talked about various parts, the various subfields of metaphysics, and there I explained that to him ontology is the general metaphysics, is the doctrine of essence. Ontology is dealing with the basic elements of being, you could say. It is dealing with concepts such as possibility, necessity, substance, quality, quantity, causality, and trying to find out what these even are. And this ontology sometimes also got called transcendental philosophy. Transcendental meaning something like overstepping, because here you would not talk about specific objects yet, like talking about God and how God is necessary, or talking about things in the world and how they are not necessary but rather contingent, depending on other things that cause them. But rather in ontology, you would just deal with the basic elements of all the objects, be they metaphysical objects like God or be they physical objects. That's why it was sometimes called transcendental philosophy and overstepping philosophy. And in Kant, choosing this name, which was in use before him, but was not used as commonly as the name ontology. But in Kant, preferring the name transcendental philosophy, we can see the critical turn he is doing. This preference of the previously less used name is reflecting the shift in Kant's thinking. It is reflecting what I just explained, that he says, well, previously we thought that ontology tells us about the actual basic elements of all the things, but now we have to understand that it is not a real ontology. It is not a doctrine of essence or of being. It is a transcendental philosophy. It tells us only about the basic elements of our thinking. Ontology can't tell us what substance or causality is. It can tell us what we by necessity think when we think of substances or of causalities. I previously, in my lecture What is Metaphysics, talked about the architectonic of Kant's system. And if you ask me what is the place that transcendental philosophy has in this architectonic system, that is actually not so easy to answer. In fact, I would say that this question is big enough to dedicate a whole doctor's thesis to. Because at different points in his writing and in his notes and in his lectures, Kant gives slightly different meanings to the word transcendental philosophy. Sometimes he calls the critique of reason propedeutics to transcendental philosophy. So that would mean that the critique is not transcendental philosophy, it is just a preparation for it. And then he seems to identify transcendental philosophy with ontology. But there are other points where it seems that transcendental philosophy is rather an umbrella term, and that the critique and ontology, for which the critique prepares us, are both part of transcendental philosophy. And then at other times, Kant seems to call the whole of pure metaphysics, that would include ontology, but also cosmology and theology. He seems to identify all of that with transcendental philosophy. And then yet other times, he seems to say that transcendental philosophy alone should be called pure metaphysics, and that all the other fields of metaphysics, even ontology, are already applied metaphysics and not pure metaphysics. So there are always these various applications of the term transcendental philosophy, and they don't all quite fit together. I won't try here in this lecture to disentangle that. because, well, this is not meant as a scholarly academic lecture. This is not meant as my doctor's thesis. This is meant as an explanation for everyone, including the layperson, what transcendental philosophy is. And therefore, I think it is best to simply describe it as follows. Transcendental is a science which steps over or beyond our regular thinking, that is the common thinking, but even the regular scientific thinking, by taking a look at its own conditions, by looking not at the object but at the subject, and asking what are the conditions in the subject that even make the object possible in the first place. So maybe you could say that regular science, including regular metaphysics, is a science of being, while transcendental science is a science of possibility. And Kant says that this transcendental question cannot only be asked in metaphysics or in philosophy. He says at some point that you could also do a transcendental grammar. So while regular grammar would ask what is a future tense, what is a progressive, what are cases in a language, what is an accusative or dative, transcendental grammar would ask what are the conditions in the thinking and speaking subject of a future tense or of cases and so on. And just like that, as regular ontology asks what is a thing and what are the basic elements of a thing, a transcendental ontology would ask, well, what are the conditions in the consciousness of a thing? What are the conditions to even think of a thing? So maybe it would be best to describe the transcendental not as a certain field of science that has its specific place in the whole architectonic of science, but rather as a method or a mode of doing science. Any science, be it ontology in Kant's case, or be it grammar. It would then be the manner in which you approach the science, or rather the specific question you are asking in the science. Once again, the question about the conditions in the subject of thinking these specific objects, which would be transcendental. It is also important for understanding Kant to understand the difference between his use of the word transcendental and the word transcendent. To be sure, both have the same Latin root. Transcendere means to step over, but still they mean quite different things in Kant. Transcendent, and I already addressed this in my lecture on what is metaphysics, transcendent Kant translates into German by überschwänglich, which means something like swinging over, and its opposite is immanent, which he translates by einheimisch, which means something like domestic. So our reason is transcendent when it swings over experience and the things we experience, and when in pure metaphysics it deals with objects that are completely beyond our experience, like God. On the other hand, our reason is immanent, that is domestic, when it stays within the bounds of our experience. That means when we think about things that we do experience, like physical objects. On the other hand, transcendental is opposed not to immanent, but to empirical. So in empirical thinking, we are thinking with experience. That may sound like it's the same to immanent thinking, but the difference is the immanent thinking is about objects of experience, but it can still be metaphysical. We can still think about these objects a priori. We can still think about them not by using experience, but by using only our reason. But still, they are objects which can be experienced. They are objects as they appear to us, not the things in themselves. And on the other hand, the empirical thinking is not just thinking about objects of experience, but it is using that experience to have knowledge of the objects. On the other hand, transcendental thinking, and this Kant does translate with überschreitend, that is overstepping. Transcendental thinking takes a step outside of experience to look at the conditions of our experience. So you could say that both the transcendent and the transcendental thinking, they are both thinking a priori. That is, they are both not using experience, they are not using empirical sensations to get to knowledge, but rather they are both thinking through pure reason. But the transcendent thinking is still a thinking of objects, like God, while the transcendental thinking is not just stepping beyond experience and trying to have knowledge about the realm of the noumena, of the things in themselves, but rather it is stepping over the object thinking completely, and it is thinking about the subject, and it is thinking about what are the conditions in the subject of thinking an object, and it is asking what are the conditions of the possibility of experience. The distinction, Kant says, between transcendental and empirical thinking usually doesn't matter. It matters only in the critique of reason. But here it is the very core of the whole question. So it would be an empirical and an immanent statement to say that there's a camera in front of me. It would be a transcendent statement to say there is a God and I know that there is a God and I can prove it. It would be a transcendental statement to say that my spatial viewing, that is me having space as a form of my viewing, of my intuition, is the condition of the possibility of the camera. That is, the camera is a three-dimensional object, and being such an object, being an object that is extended in space, me viewing things in space is a condition of that camera. The camera could not exist, that is, not as a thing in itself, but as a thing that appears to me. It could not appear to me if I wouldn't view things in space. That is a transcendental statement, but at the same time, it is still an immanent use of reason, because I'm still being domestic, so to say. I'm still speaking about the camera, not about God, who is completely beyond my experience. I'm not speaking about the camera from experience. I'm rather saying what is the condition that experience of the camera is even possible. Like, I have actual experience of my camera. I'm actually seeing it right now. You people are not seeing my camera, but experience of it is at least possible for you. You could come over here and step into my room and see the camera. But why? Because you, like me, view things in space. And if we didn't have this spatial viewing, then the camera as an object that is extended in space could not appear to us. That is a transcendental statement. Now, the transcendental philosophy is idealistic. So now I have to explain what is transcendental idealism. Before I get into that, however, I want to give a disclaimer of sorts. The following will be very important. It is crucial to understanding Kant, because his transcendental idealism, that is what his philosophy is all about, and that is the clue to solving the problem of his critique. And all four parts of his critique, that is the critique of our cognition, the critique of our pleasure and displeasure, that is of the beautiful and the sublime, and the critique of our desiring, that is the critique of morality, as well as finally his critique of religion. All of that is based on his transcendental idealism, and without understanding this worldview, you cannot understand Kant. But what's more, this is not just about Kant, this is about philosophy in general, because after Kant, you cannot be a transcendental realist anymore. That would be the opposite of transcendental idealism. If nowadays an author, a would-be philosopher, a book, is a transcendental realist, they need to be just thrown away. We don't even need to engage with them. To be a transcendental realist over 200 years after Kant would be like being geocentrist centuries after Copernicus. It simply can't be taken seriously. However, I have found time and again that many people, including people who have read Kant or who have dealt with philosophy all their lives, including professors, simply don't get transcendental idealism. I'm not talking about them disagreeing with it. I'm talking about them not understanding it. Which of course can lead to disagreement, but then they don't know what they're actually disagreeing with. In fact, I would say that the world is only split into transcendental idealists and people who don't understand transcendental idealism. Maybe because they never heard of it, never thought about it, or because they did hear about it but still didn't understand it. Because once you do understand transcendental idealism, you become a transcendental idealist. It's just evident to you then that this is the truth. And once you became a transcendental idealist, you stay one. Usually with any sort of opinion, with any sort of faith or ideology, you have people who very strongly believe in it, but you will always have some people who at some point change their minds. You have right-wingers who became left-wingers, and you have left-wingers who became right-wingers, and you have believers that turned into atheists, and atheists that found faith. But not so with transcendental idealism. You have people who disagree with it because they didn't understand it yet. But I don't know of a single person, whether alive, whether amongst the people that I personally know, or historically, I don't know of a single person who at one point subscribed to transcendental idealism and actually understood what it is, but later changed their mind. No, once you have understood it, you also know that it is true. It's like in mathematics. I don't know of a single person who understood the theorem of Pythagoras and then afterwards, at some point in his life, changed his mind and said, no, Pythagoras was wrong. Once you understand this theorem, you simply understand that this is a correct formula for calculating the sides of right triangles. And once you understand transcendental idealism, you simply understand that this is the correct way to look at the world. But many simply do not understand it. And that is curious, because it is, in a way, not a difficult thought. Quite the opposite. It is the most simple thought you could imagine. It is so simple that once you have understood and adopted transcendental idealism, it starts sounding almost trivial to you. And you start wondering how you didn't figure it out sooner, and how most people never figure it out. How it's possible that not every child understands transcendental idealism. How is it then that so many, even when exposed to it and even when it's explained to them, just do not get it? Like they seem incapable of understanding it. And this is an important question. Kant's critical method, about which I talked in a previous lecture, demands that we ask this question. That it's not just enough to prove transcendental idealism is right and transcendental realism is wrong, but rather that we must explain how, if transcendental idealism is right, how it does not seem right to everyone. And I would answer here that this is not about how smart you are. Like, you don't need to be super smart to understand transcendental idealism because it's so complex, and you're not dumb if you don't understand it. No, very, very smart people don't understand it, and some less smart people do. Rather, what is so complicated here is that this is a completely new way of thinking. You need to turn around 180 degrees. You need to turn everything from its head onto its heels. And therefore, it's not something that can simply be explained to you, and you can simply understand on a discursive, on a conceptual level, but you yourself have to transform yourself. You have to adopt a new view, a new way of looking at things. And if you don't do that, then no matter how well it gets explained to you, you just won't get it. Don't despair, however. My advice is just try to listen and just try to give it some time. Once you listen to this lecture, you should maybe listen to the lecture again, or maybe you should continue and listen to the following lectures, because in this one I will just give a general overview over transcendental idealism, and in the upcoming lectures I will go into more detail and hopefully make things more clear. Or, don't just listen to me. Read some things. Read Kant or read Fichte, who often is even more clear about transcendental idealism. And with time, and with continued exposure to transcendental idealism, you will hopefully come to understand it eventually. It will hopefully click at some point. Don't expect to understand it right away. I promise that if you have never heard of transcendental idealism before, you will not understand it after this lecture. Not because this lecture will be so bad. I mean, maybe it will, that's for you to judge, but I will try to do my best. But I am very much convinced that even the best possible lecture or the best possible text will not make anyone understand transcendental idealism the first time, because it's just too new to grasp. You need time for it. I didn't understand it either the first time I got into it, the first time I read Kant. I needed time, and so do you. So I'm saying, just don't despair, just give yourself that time. And apply Kant's skeptical method. That is, if something doesn't make sense to you right away, don't outright dismiss transcendental idealism. Rather, suspend your judgment. You don't have to agree right away, but you shouldn't disagree either. You should accept that you don't understand it at first, and you should give it time and put some work, put some actual effort into understanding it. But with that out of the way, what does transcendental idealism mean? Well, as the name suggests, it is a type of idealism. And if this was a lecture about idealism in general, I could talk for hours about the various ways this word has been used in the history of philosophy. There are many types of idealism. There's transcendental idealism, there's subjective idealism, there's objective idealism, there is real idealism and ideal realism. It can become quite complicated, especially since many different theories or worldviews have been described as idealism, even though they are at odds with each other or outright contradict each other. However, thankfully, I don't need to give a general explanation here what idealism might mean. I can stick to Kant's definitions. To him, you are either an idealist or you are a realist. And idealism in this case means that you believe there's only thinking. You believe that everything, all the objects you perceive, everything is just a thought. So to the idealist, the whole world is a dream, so to speak. On the other hand, realism to Kant would mean saying that the objects you perceive, they are actually real objects. They are not just mere thoughts that you dreamed up, but they actually have a reality of their own, independent from your consciousness. Independent from your thinking of them and your perceiving them. However, it is very important now to understand in what way Kant is an idealist. Because there is a type of idealism, which he calls empirical idealism, which he does not subscribe to. Rather, in his critique of pure reason, he goes to great lengths to refute this idealism. Kant's idealism is transcendental. He also at times calls it critical idealism, and he even prefers that name. But transcendental idealism is the name more commonly used in the history of philosophy, be it by Kant himself, be it by Fichte. His idealism is transcendental. That means the empirical idealist, he is actually denying the existence of the object of our experience. The empirical idealist says what we experience is not real. It is just our imagination, we are just dreaming, whatever. This, Kant says, is completely wrong. Kant stresses that his transcendental idealism is an empirical realism. That means that the things we experience are real to Kant. That is the empirical realism. They are not just hallucinations, but they have reality not as things in themselves, but as the things we experience. That is, as the things as they appear to us. That is the transcendental idealism. So here you should definitely go back to my previous lecture about the question how are synthetic judgments a priori possible, because there I talked about this distinction between the things as they appear to us, the sensibilia or phenomena, and the things in themselves, the intelligiblia or noumena. And transcendental idealism is saying that, once again, the empirical objects are real, but only as empirical objects, not as things in themselves. That, in short, is the whole statement that transcendental idealism states, but I assume that this is not enough to make clear what this is all about. So let's delve into it a little deeper and into more detail. The great insight of transcendental idealism is basically that all our cognitions and all our experience are always about the things that appear to us and not about the things in themselves. All that we experience, Kant says, is relations. Relations between the things and relations of the things and us. Imagine you see a ball. walling against another ball. And now you see the second ball starting to wall away, being pushed by the first one. What is it, if you think about it, that you are seeing here? You are seeing extension in space. You are seeing movement in space. In a way, one could say you are seeing that space itself, but those are all just relations, right? Extension, movement, those are relations to the space, to the other objects. That is not what the object is in itself. You are seeing the first ball hitting the other ball, and now the second ball starts to move. So you are seeing their relation. Imagine they had no relation. Imagine the first ball would just magically pass through the second ball. And now imagine the ball also would not just have no relation of causality to the second ball, but imagine it would also not have any relation of causality to the light. So imagine light would also magically pass through that ball instead of being reflected by it and coming into your eye. So now you would not see the first ball making the second ball move, because it would pass right through it. And you would also not see the first ball at all, because the light would pass right through it. Well, then what would you see? You would see nothing. And now imagine that it wasn't just about seeing. Imagine you could also not touch the ball. Because when you touch something, again, what you perceive is a relation. You don't feel what the thing is in itself. You only feel how the thing affects you. Namely, that the thing stops you in your movement. That the thing is a sort of barrier where you can't go further. If that wasn't the case, if you could just put your hand right through the thing without feeling the tiniest bit of a barrier, and likewise you couldn't see the thing because it wouldn't reflect the light, there would not be a thing, for, at least not for you. So all you ever perceive and experience are the relations that the things have between each other and mostly to you. You don't ever perceive what the thing is in itself, independently of the relations it has to other things and independently of how it affects other things. That is the insight the transcendental idealist has. God may be able to see the things as they are, because he made them. But we, as human beings, can never have cognition of the thing in itself. The very name points at that. The very term thing in itself, not thing for us, not thing as it appears to us, already shows that we have no cognition, no understanding of the thing in itself. Now, most people, the common people, they will not think like that, of course. When they see a tree, a dog, a house, they will say, I see a tree, I see a dog, therefore there is a tree, there is a dog. So to them, their representation that they have in their consciousness shows that there actually is a thing outside of their consciousness which is being represented by that representation. In fact, they will not even say, I see a dog, therefore there is a dog. They will just say, there's a dog. I see it. So the common person will not even reflect this much, and will not say that this is a conclusion he is drawing, that from seeing a dog he is concluding that there must be a dog causing that sensation, but rather he will just say that he is seeing the dog, he is seeing the thing in itself. So the common person is not just saying that the thing that appears to us is identical with the thing in itself. He's not just saying the thing in itself appears to us as it is. Rather, he's not even making the distinction between appearance and thing in itself. And I've often found that many people who don't deal with philosophy, when you do make this distinction, they refuse to make it. They dismiss it, or they even get angry at it. And they will say, oh, this is just empty speculation. This is just talking. Clearly, I have a dog in front of me. I have a tree in front of me. Clearly, there's really a dog here, or there's really a tree here. They will probably fall back on their so-called common sense, that divining rod, as Kant calls it. Now, this common sense they speak about is nothing but a prejudice. It is nothing but a formula to express their complete refusal to think, to use reason. This common sense just means I don't want to think about this. I don't want to question this. I don't want to reflect. Because ultimately, these people are a-rationalists. They don't believe that reason is a thing. To them, what must be replied to them is that not just transcendental philosophy points in this direction, but even regular natural science points out that what we perceive is how nature appears to us, not how nature in itself is. I mean, thanks to science, we are very much aware that the same nature can appear differently to different beings. So we may not see certain colors, like ultraviolet, while other beings, like certain insects, may be able to see it. On the other hand, there are animals who don't see all the colors that we see. Or we may see things in a certain frequency. A fly can, for example, react faster to things because it has a different frequency of seeing things. What is a fast movement to us is maybe a very slow or medium movement to a fly. And if we go deeper into physics, then the whole world, as it usually appears to us, basically vanishes once we go into atom physics or even into quantum physics. I mean, in normal day-to-day life, it appears to us that there is matter. It appears to us that things, like the objects we deal with, our own bodies, like these things are concrete blocks of matter without any holes. But then we find that no, they are actually made up of myriads of atoms with spaces in between them. And the quantum physicist will tell you that basically nothing in this world if you go to the smallest level, is even close to how it appears to you. Kant himself uses the example of a rainbow at some point, saying the rainbow is what appears to us, but clearly there is not really a bow of various colors in the sky. So you could say that the thing in itself here is the water, the drop of rain, and the sunlight, which is passing through that water, and the colored bow in the sky is just the appearance of that light passing through the prism of this raindrop. Or another example that Kant gives, and that is an even better example, is color. He says that a red rose just appears to be red to us. It is not red in itself, right? This is what physics has shown us, that things don't actually have colors. And I mean, if you think about that, what should that even mean, to say that a thing in itself has a color? And even if it had a color in itself, how should that color get from the thing to which it is attached into our mind, into our consciousness? No, rather the things reflect the light in a certain way, and the light falls into our eyes, and our brain is processing it, and depending on the different wavelengths of the light, we see different colors. So you could say that the rose in itself is not red. The rose as it appears to us is red, and if we were not able to perceive the color red, and if there was no being in the universe which was able to perceive red, then red roses would not exist. Roses would still exist probably, but they would not be red, because no one would see them as red. However, these are just examples or analogies to guide you towards what transcendental idealism is. This is not, however, transcendental idealism itself. And Kant points out that these examples or analogies, that they come with a certain danger of putting you on the wrong track, because the colorless rose or the raindrop, as opposed to the red rose or the rainbow, that is not the thing in itself Kant is talking about. That, to him, is still an appearance. Kant at some point calls it the physical thing in itself. So you could say that in the realm of experience, the sensible objects, the phenomena, appear to us in a certain way. For example, the rose appears to us red. And you could say that the phenomena in themselves, that is, as physical objects in themselves, are different from how they appear to us. But still, even so, the physical thing in itself is still an appearance, not the actual thing in itself. You could say that it is the appearance in itself, so the true nature of what the appearance actually is, but it is still only the appearance of a thing. As soon as an object in some way affects us, it is not a thing in itself to Kant, but it is an appearance of a thing. It is that thing as it affects us. So even when you go to the level of the atoms or to the quantum level, you are still not dealing with the thing in itself. You're only dealing maybe with the physical thing in itself. And maybe you could say this is what natural science does. Natural science tries to go from the appearance of the appearance to the appearance in itself, to the physical thing in itself. So natural science tries to go from our common perception to the inner nature of the appearance. But being natural science, dealing with nature, nature is always what appears to us, it still only deals with appearances. It still is not metaphysics, which tries to go beyond the appearance and which tries to understand the thing in itself. And here I remind you again of the error of the Leibniz-Wolffian school, about which I talked in the previous lecture on the question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? In that lecture, I talked about the difference between sensuality and intellectuality, and therefore also the difference between appearance and thing in itself. And I mentioned how to the Leibniz-Wolffian school, the difference was not in quality but in degree. That is, to them, sensuality was just a more confused, a more distorted, and intellectuality was just a more clear way of cognition. But they were both cognition of the same thing. And here you can maybe better understand the error they made. They were talking, without realizing it, they were talking about appearances only. They were talking our sensuality gives us the physical thing as it appears, and our intellectuality gives us the physical thing in itself. For example, when I look at my hand, I see a hand, but then when I think about it, I realize it is made up of various cells. And if I go further in my thinking, I realize the cells of my body are made up of various atoms. That was their difference between sensuality and thinking. But what Kant is saying, that even the cells or even the atoms, they may constitute the physical thing in itself. Because yes, what appears to be a hand is actually a bunch of distinct atoms. But still, they are not the actual thing in itself. Because even the atoms, they affect us. So they still are not what the thing in itself is, but they still are how that thing appears to us. To Kant, I explained in the previous lecture, the difference between sensuality and intellectuality is not just one of degree, but one of principle. Intellectuality is not dealing with what appears to us, not even with the true nature of what appears to us, because it is spontaneous and not just reflective. So the thing in itself that Kant or that transcendental philosophy is talking about, that is the transcendental object as Kant also sometimes calls it, you could say that is the thing in itself. So if the physical thing in itself is just the appearance in itself, then the transcendental object, the transcendental thing in itself, is the thing in itself in itself. And this, Kant says, is basically just an X. It's a complete unknown. We can't make any sort of statement about it, because as soon as we take it into our consciousness, as soon as we try to have some cognition and understanding of this unknown X, of this transcendental object, it is no longer the thing in itself. It is no longer that transcendental object, but rather it is already the object as it appears to us, as it affects us. So we can't possibly know the thing in itself. Kant stresses that it is just a negative concept. So we can't make any positive statements about what it is. We can only say what it is not. It is not a essential object. It is not a phenomenon. It is not something that appears to us and affects us, and from which we receive some sort of sensations, but rather it is something that is independent of us. That is all we can say about it. It is only an object of our thinking. We necessarily have to think. Once we realize that everything that appears to us, everything that affects us, is just that, an appearance, then we necessarily have to think of a transcendental object, of this unknown X, behind the appearances. But we can't say any more of it, except it is not a thing as it appears to us. Now, while this thing in itself is defined as something which, well, exists in itself, independently of us, the appearance needs someone, some subject, to whom it appears, in order to even exist as an appearance. We maybe can think of an object existing without a subject, but we cannot exist of the object of an appearance existing without a subject to which it appears. And that means that the whole world is dependent on us. But I will stress that by this I don't mean the intelligible world, that is the world of the things in themselves. They don't depend on us. But our world, the whole sensible world, the world of the things as they appear, that world depends on us. And in that sense, Kant is an idealist, because he famously says that the statement, I think, must possibly accompany all our cognition and all our consciousness, accompany all our thinking. I will stress the word possibly. Kant is not saying that we are always conscious in every moment of our thinking of our own subject. We are not always thinking I whenever we are thinking something else. You could probably say that this is something that first needs to develop. So the newborn child doesn't have a conscious I yet, and it first starts looking at objects. It first starts perceiving its parents, its toys, and when it starts learning to talk, I is probably not going to be its first word. And only after a while, because this already requires a high level of reflection, will it realize there are not just things surrounding me, but there's a me who perceives these things and who is affected by these things. But even after that, and even as when it's grown up, the child will, or the grown up now, will still not say I in every possible situation. But what Kant is saying there is that it must be possible to accompany each and every thought you have with the statement I think. So, of course, in everyday life, we say, and even the transcendental idealist says, there's a dog, there's a tree. But what we could say, and what would be more correct to say in the strict sense, would be, here a dog appears to me, here a tree appears to me. That means that the dog, the tree, they depend on me. Not as things in themselves, but as appearances, they depend on an I to whom they can appear. And you cannot possibly imagine things without, at least indirectly, maybe you don't reflect on it, but at least indirectly, including in that the imagining of an I, of a subject who experiences these things. Like, for example, of course, I can imagine a faraway planet that is uninhabited. Of course, I can imagine this planet in another time when it was uninhabited. But when I see in front of my mental eye, so to say, when I see the vast desert of this uninhabited planet, the rocks and the dust, or when I see this planet being full of volcanoes and lava, I am still seeing something in my imagination. That is, I imagine this as a sort of film, a sort of movie in front of my inner eye. Even if I don't outright imagine a person standing in the midst of it and watching all of this, I am still watching it as if I was there. Maybe not there with my body, just there as a sort of ghost, or maybe as if a camera was there and now sending the pictures to me, but still I can't help but imagine these objects, the rocks, the volcanoes, as they would appear, as they would look like. And I can't even think of them independently, truly independently of a subject. But, and this is the core, this is the great twist of Kant's transcendental idealism. If all the objects that appear are dependent on the subject to whom they appear for their very existence, not their existence in itself, but their existence as appearances, this can't be stressed enough times, then that means that the way that the subject is thinking, the way the faculty of cognition of that subject works, contains the very possibility of the objects. It means that, as Kant puts it, the conditions of the possibility of experience are identical with the conditions of the objects of experience. So, for example, and I will talk about this in an upcoming lecture in 2 weeks, Kant says that time and space are the two forms of intuition, of viewing, that we have as humans. So everything we view, everything that appears to us in time and space. Time and space are conditions of the possibility of experience for us. When something is not in time and space, like God, then it can't appear to us. God may exist as a thing in itself, but he can't possibly exist as an appearance, as a phenomenon, because he is beyond time and space, but all phenomena for us are bound to time and space, because time and space are the condition of the possibility of a phenomenon. So even the Almighty God cannot possibly make us understand him as he is in himself. Even with his almightiness, he still would be forced to appear to us. And then we would not understand him in himself, but only in the way he appears to us. And this appearance would have to happen in time and space, because we can't have any sort of experience outside of time and space. So even God would be forced to submit to our forms of intuition. And I mean, that's just the case in the various myths, right? So if you think of the Old Testament, of God appearing to Moses, he appears through the burning bush. God in himself is probably not a burning bush, but God in himself cannot be perceived by us. If he wants to in some way appear to us, that revelation has to happen in time. Like, there must be a certain point in time where he reveals himself to us. And if he wants to be seen like a physical object, then he needs to assume a form in space, like, for example, a bush. So everything that could ever possibly appear to us would need to appear in time and space, and something that is not temporal and not spatial cannot exist as an appearance, as a phenomenon. And that, once again, means that this condition of the possibility of experience is a condition of the objects of experience. I cannot make experience outside of time and space. Therefore, time and space are not just conditions of my experience, they are conditions of the objects of that experience. These very objects cannot exist in any other way or form except in time and space. Because if they don't exist in time and space, they would not exist at all as appearances, as things that affect me. As things in themselves, as that unknown X, that transcendental object, that's another question. But as things that appear to me, they have to exist within time and space. That is what Kant's transcendental idealism is saying. In my experience, it is not Kant's idealism that people struggle with. Rather, it is the transcendentalness of that idealism, which they don't understand. So very often, I find Kant misinterpreted as if he was a proponent of some sort of empirical idealism. That is, as if he was saying all the things that appear to us, they are not real, they are just illusions. Even in Kant's own time, that misunderstanding actually existed, and he very vehemently tried to correct that misunderstanding, which he said was almost inexcusable and seemed to almost be a willful and mean-spirited distortion of his words. But I find this happening a lot when it comes to people criticizing Kant. They criticize him for being an empirical idealist in their minds, even though he stressed very much that he wasn't. So I remember one time at university, I had one professor. As a side note, it's the very same professor I talked about in the last lecture, who thought that there are analytical judgments a posteriori. At one time, this professor held a pencil in his hand, and he said, "What I'm holding here is a pencil. This is a real pencil. Old Kant can say whatever he wants. This is not just the appearance of a pencil. This is actually a pencil." Now, a statement like that is unworthy of a philosopher, because you are just refusing to listen to reason. Rather, you stick to this primitive realism, just saying, no, this is how it seems to me, therefore it must be true, I don't want to think about this further. Well, if we can do that, then the crazy person would be equally justified to say that his hallucinations are real. Like, he could be seeing white mice that aren't really there, and he could say, no, the old psychiatrist can say whatever he wants. What I see here are white mice, period. But with that aside, old Kant would actually agree with my professor. What did the professor say? He said, what I'm holding in my hand is not just the appearance of a pencil, it is a pencil. And to that, Kant would say, yes, it is indeed a pencil. But a pencil is an appearance. There is nothing a pencil is apart from being a phenomenon, being a sensible object. A pencil is an object that exists in space, that has a certain extension in space. It is an object that can be seen, that can be felt, and it is impossible to even conceive of a pencil beyond the way a pencil affects us. The object is not the appearance of a pencil, it is the appearance of a thing in itself. The thing in itself is not a pencil. It is just this transcendental object, this unknown X about which we can't make any possible statement. So what you hold in your hand is indeed a pencil, but a pencil is an appearance. Not of a pencil, but of a thing in itself. And I think this is where the confusion comes from. Because people hear the pencil is just an appearance, and what they are hearing is, so Kant is saying, I'm not holding a real pencil, I'm just sort of dreaming the pencil, and this is not actually a pencil, what I have in my hand. But that is not what Kant is saying. He is saying this is actually a pencil. And this is not just in your head. It is a pencil not just to you, but to any human being. We all have to agree on it. We all see the same pencil. We all feel the same pencil when we take it into our hand. But the pencil is an appearance. As a pencil, it is an appearance. It's not that a pencil just appears to me even though there is no pencil. There is a pencil who appears to everyone. But a pencil is just an appearing thing. And in itself, this thing is probably not a pencil. What it is in itself, we can't say. I think the confusion in my professor came from the fact that appearance, when people hear the word appearance, they think illusion. This confusion is even more prominent in the German, because the German word for appearance is Erscheinung and the German word for illusion is Schein. So Erscheinung contains shine. So it can sound as if it was just an illusion, just sort of dreamt up hallucination. But that is not what Kant is saying. And here I recommend watching my previous lecture on Kant's critical method, because in that I talked about what illusion, what error means to Kant. And I explained that to him it means confusing your subjective perspective for the objective one. So when we look at the sky over the course of the day, we see the sun moving across the sky. That is not an illusion in itself. That is just how the sun appears to us. The sun, because of our perspective, because of us standing here on Earth, far away from the sun, while the Earth is circling around itself, to us, the sun appears as moving across the sky. It only becomes an illusion once we forget our subjective perspective and once we presume that our view is objective. Once we start saying the sun doesn't just appear to us as moving across the sky, but it actually does move, instead of recognizing that we are the ones who move. Then this turns into an illusion. But the mere moving across the sky of the sun is just its appearance. It's not an illusion as long as we are aware of it. And in the same way, Kant would say transcendental idealism is not saying that everything is just an illusion. Rather, to the transcendental idealist alone, it is not an illusion. It is the transcendental realist. So the person who thinks they are dealing with the things in itself and perceiving the things in itself, it is he alone who is under an illusion, because he is forgetting his subjectivity. He is saying, this pencil in my hand is not just a thing that appears to me, but is a thing in itself. But the transcendental idealist, he is saying, well, the thing in itself, about which I know nothing, which I can only treat as an unknown X, that thing in this situation appears to me as a pencil. And then the pencil is not an illusion anymore. It is an appearance, but not an illusion, because I am not forgetting my subjectivity. We can also ask, what does truth even mean? And the logicians in Kant's time, and he agrees with them on that, they define truth as follows. A statement is true when there is accordance between the statement and its object. So, if I say, for example, I'm wearing a red t-shirt and my t-shirt is actually red, then my statement is true, because the statement and the object which it is about, they match each other. If I say I'm wearing a red t-shirt and my t-shirt is actually blue, then the statement does not match the object and therefore it is not true. But that means, Kant says, that truth, and talking about truth and also talking about untruth, talking about illusion, makes only sense in a context where it even is possible to talk about truth. Like a general complete skepticism, saying all the statements are untrue, no statement actually matches the object which it is making a statement about, is not possible, because I can only judge the truth of a statement if I can judge if it matches the object. So the claim this is an error only makes sense if instead of an error, truth is even possible. So when I make the statement, I am holding a pencil in my hand, then that statement is true when there's indeed an object in my hand that is a pencil. When there's another object in my hand, like a pen, or when there is no object in my hand, then the statement is not true. In order for this statement to even make sense, and in order for us to even be able about talking whether it's true or not, we must assume that there is such a thing as a hand which can hold objects, and there is such a thing as a pencil, or at least such a thing as a pencil would be possible, because otherwise saying the statement is wrong makes no sense. So if I were to tell somebody, you are wrong, you think you're holding a pencil, but the pencil in your hand is just an illusion, then I'm saying this pencil that you believe to be holding is an illusion, but in theory it would be possible for you to be holding a pencil. And transcendental idealism is not saying that it is impossible to hold a pencil. Quite the opposite. Transcendental idealism says that there's indeed a pencil in your hand. Yes, it is an appearance, not a thing in itself, but there is no other possible reality outside of the sensible world, outside of the things as they appear, in which things like hands or pencils could even exist, so in which it was even possible to be holding a pencil. So the statement does indeed match its object. An illusion, Kant says, is only valid for me, who has the illusion. So if I see white mice, nobody else will see them, because they are not hallucinating like me. The criteria for truth is that it is valid for everyone, for every intellect. And that is the case when it comes to the pencil. It's not just that professor who was believing to be holding a pencil, but we all could see the pencil in his hand. We all could have taken it into our own hands. Our intellects were in accord with each other, because it was not just an illusion, it was true. But it was a true appearance, not a true thing in itself. You could also say that empirical idealism which claims all the objects are just illusions, is a material idealism. It is saying that materially, in their very existence, these objects are just thoughts of ours. While Kant's transcendental or critical idealism is a formal idealism. He's not saying that the objects are thoughts and nothing but thoughts. In themselves, as transcendental objects, they are not our thoughts, he is saying, but formally, so in the way they appear to us, they are representations in our consciousness. And ironically, even though Kant gets and got even in his own time accused of skepticism and of empirical idealism, ironically, as Kant points out, it is the other way around. If you are a transcendental realist, as indeed almost all people are, including even most philosophers, that is, if you believe to be dealing with the things in themselves, then you are in danger of becoming a skeptic and even an empirical idealist, because if you believe what you perceive to be the thing in itself, you can start wondering, well, okay, but what if my perception somehow distorts the thing? What if my perception is giving me not a true image of how that thing really is, but rather a wrong image? Like if I walked through the world wearing green glasses all the time, the things would seem to be green to me, but maybe not because they really were green, but because of my glasses. So I would have to be skeptical of their green color. But transcendental idealism is different. It's saying we are not simply wearing green glasses, but rather we have eyes, and the glasses are something which just distorts reality. But the eyes, they are something which in a way makes reality, because if we had no eyes, if we were not, so to say, optical beings who see things, then there would not be any visible things, there would not be any colors. These colors, therefore, are not illusions, they are how the things really are, but the things that appear to us, not the things in themselves. The transcendental idealist can respond to the skeptic. You don't need to be scared that your cognition somehow distorts reality, because there is no reality apart from your cognition. Reality is what you have a cognition of. And that means that if truth is the content of your statement matching with the object that the statement is about, that means that our statements about the world are true, because they do match the object. But the object they are about is not the thing in itself, it is the world as it appears to us. And Kant says that the empirical idealist is indeed very much wrong and fanatical when it turns things into mere representations, claiming that they are not really things, they are just images in our head. But, Kant says, transcendental realism is equally wrong and is dreamlike when it turns representations into things. So when it claims that which, so to say, is in our head, in our mind, actually exists outside of us. So when the question is, are my statements about the world true or not, all depends on the sense in which I mean the statements. When I make the statement that the rose, for example, when I'm seeing a rose, the rose is extended in space. The rose is a three-dimensional object. All depends on what do I mean by that. If I mean to say the rose in itself, independently of how it affects me, is extended, then that is a wrong statement. Then I'm under an illusion indeed. But if what I mean to say is the rose as it appears to me is extended, then there's nothing wrong in that. Then my statement matches the object. The appearance of the rose is indeed extended and couldn't possibly be any other way. And I mean, this is how we mean it in everyday life when we speak. So let's get back to the difference between the physical appearance and the physical object in itself. When I say the rose is red, with the knowledge of our modern physics, I don't mean to say that the rose as a physical thing in itself is red. Rather, I mean the rose as an appearance of that physical thing in itself is red. And in that sense, the statement is correct. If I was talking about the physical thing in itself, that rose is not red. You could say that rose is not even a rose, like a solid object. Rather, it's made up of many, many atoms and so on. But when we talk to each other, we are fully aware that this is not how the statement is meant. The statement is meant as the rose that appears to us. The rose as we see it is red. And when we mean the statement in that way, it matches its object and is therefore a true statement. The difference between the statements the rose is red and the rose is extended in space is that in the first case, the statement is subjective. The rose is appearing as red to me with the senses that I have. And other people who perceive colors differently, or maybe other species who perceive them completely differently, might not see the rose as red. And the redness is not necessary for the rose to even exist as a rose. It's just that I subjectively perceive the rose as red. But the statement that the rose is extended in space is not only true as a subjective statement, I perceive the rose as red, but rather it is true as an objective statement. It's not just that I personally perceive the rose as extended in space and someone else might perceive the rose as not extended in space, but rather the rose, not just as my subjective appearance of an appearance, but as the objective appearance, as an objective phenomenon, is a spatially extended three-dimensional thing. Because that is what a rose is. That is part of a rose. And the rose could not exist as a rose, as something appearing to me as a rose, if it didn't exist as a spatially extended object. And in that way, transcendental idealism is the only possible answer and the only possible solution to complete skepticism and to the empirical idealism it leads to. And the common person, the common layperson who doesn't think about philosophical questions, can be excused for not being a transcendental idealist, but still not thinking that everything is just a hallucination or an illusion. But the expert, the people who want to be called philosophers, they have to be either transcendental idealists or they have to doubt everything. And a third position is not possible. So if someone wants to be taken seriously in philosophy, if someone wants to be a philosopher, but they are neither transcendental idealist nor complete skeptic, you can dismiss them. Their thinking is not consistent and consequential, and therefore must not be taken seriously in a scientific philosophical debate. But transcendental idealism is not only the only salvation from skepticism, rather it is necessary both for religion and for natural science. Let's start with religion. If we are transcendental idealists, so if we say the world we perceive is just that, it is a perception, it is the sensible world, the world of the phenomena, the world that appears to us, then Kant says that very thought by necessity leads us to the idea of an intelligible world, of a world of the things in themselves, of a noumenal world. And there could be a place for God in that world. That in itself is not proof for God, because once again, the transcendental object is just a negative concept. We can only say what it is not. It is not the thing that appears to us in time and space. But what it is, whether it is God or something else, we can't say. But at least this leaves open the possibility for there being a God beyond the sensible world. If, however, on the other hand, you are a transcendental realist, you are someone who believes that the sensible world that you perceive is the only world and is the appearances are the thing in themselves, then there is no place for God. Then if you want to believe in some sort of God, there are only two possibilities. Either you want to say that God is separate from the other things of the world, but if these things are things in themselves, then God can only be one thing amongst other things. Then you must believe in a limited God. Then you can have gods like the gods of polytheistic myths, like the gods of the Greek myths, who walk around on Earth, ruling over parts of the cosmos, interacting with the cosmos. But you can't have an all-powerful God who himself is not part of the world. Or, on the other hand, if you believe you are dealing with the things in themselves, but you don't want your God to be one limited thing amongst other things, but you do want your God to be eternal and limitless, then the only possible conclusion is to say the world itself is God. Then you must be a pantheist. Pantheism being the belief that everything, pan, is God, theos. And that was the position of Spinoza. who famously talked about Deus sive natura, God or nature, who were one to him. And I previously mentioned the great pantheism controversy, which happened in the German intellectual world in the 1780s, because Jacobi claimed that all the Leibniz-Wolffian dogmatic philosophy, to which someone like Moses Mendelssohn subscribed, ultimately, if you thought it through, necessarily led to Spinozism, to pantheism. And Jacobi was right. And Kant agreed with Jacobi. Now, Kant didn't agree with Jacobi that therefore you should dismiss this philosophy and rationality altogether. He, with his transcendental idealism, had found a way out of that. But if you are a dogmatic, if you are a transcendental realist who believes that the things he's dealing with are the things in themselves, and who still wants to believe in an eternal and limitless God, then you have to equate this God with nature. Because there can't be anything beyond the nature you are perceiving if that nature is already the thing in itself. God is the thing in itself. So if nature is the thing in itself, nature is God. So if you don't want to believe in limited polytheistic gods, and if you don't want to be a pantheist and believe that the world as a whole is God, and if you don't want to be an atheist, then your only option is transcendental idealism. Because if you say the world, nature, is just an appearance, then there's still the possibility that beyond that, in the realm of the intelligible thing in itself, there is a God. So that means that all the people, for example, who call themselves Christians or Muslims or Jews, if they want to have a coherent worldview that makes sense and that can't very easily be attacked and disproven, must be transcendental idealists. There is no way around that. Now, back then, in the 18th century, that mattered quite a lot to people, and the pantheism controversy was a very big controversy in philosophy back then. Of course, nowadays we live in much more atheistic times, so many people might not care about that much. They might not care about how to possibly save religion because they don't want to save it. But, as I already said, it is not just religion that requires transcendental idealism, but actually natural science also doesn't make sense without transcendental idealism. Because what does natural science do? It tries to find the laws of nature. And we talk about that usually without wondering much about what that's even supposed to mean. But we should wonder about it. As Plato says, philosophy starts with wondering. That is, with not just taking things for granted, but rather questioning them. And once you do start to question, it starts actually becoming a very big question. Because usually when we talk about laws, like we have laws in the state because there's a lawgiver who made the laws, and the laws are also enforced. That is, people are forced by the police force and so on to obey the law. But what about nature? When we say there is a law of nature, why is there a law? Where is the law? Is it written down somewhere? Was it made by God? That would be very unscientific to claim that. But I mean, nature is not a computer program that has a source code that determines how it must behave. So how can there be a law of nature? And why are the objects in nature forced to conform to that law? Like, when objects fall down, we say this is gravity. This is Earth's gravity pulling the object toward it. But why? Why does this work? Why is the object forced to submit to this gravity? Why can't it just say to Earth, no, I don't want to obey you. I don't want to be pulled close to you. I will go my own way. When we see ice melting in the sun, we say, well, that's the heat. And according to the laws of nature, the heat leads to the ice melting. But why? Why is the ice forced to, so to say, submit to this heat and let it melt it? And then, even if there were laws of nature that govern nature, and even if you put the question aside how that is possible, then the next question would be, how would we, as human beings, be able to understand and to inquire into these laws? I mean, we are just an accident of evolution. We are tiny, insignificant creatures who live on some tiny speck of dust floating through vast space, existing only for the blink of an eye compared with the whole existence of the universe. How should it possibly be that we can penetrate, so to say, the very core of the universe, and that we, who ourselves are part of this universe, just an accidental tiny part of this universe, that we, with our limited brains, can understand the very mechanics of this universe, can understand how this universe works? Is it not presumptuous? Is it not the highest form of hubris to do natural science? To assume that we could be able to understand how nature works? And then, thirdly, how is it that natural science can apply mathematics to nature? How does that work? Because mathematics is a pure science. It's a science a priori. We don't just have it from experience. We don't just experience that the world follows mathematical rules. Rather, mathematics is a product of our own intellect. How is it that nature conforms to this product of our own intellect? I mean, we could imagine a world where we can have mathematics in our minds and make up mathematical rules and formulas that work in our minds, but that had nothing to do with reality and couldn't be applied to reality. Why is it that reality can be understood through mathematics by physicists? None of this makes even the slightest sense if you are a transcendental realist and if you believe that nature is something which exists in itself, independently of our intellect. But to the transcendental idealist, who says that this nature, which natural science is observing and researching is not a thing in itself, but only something that appears to us, to the transcendental idealist, it makes perfect sense. Because he will say the laws of nature that natural science is dealing with are not really the laws of nature. There are no laws of nature independent of us, because there is no nature independent of us. Rather, these laws are the laws of our intellect, the laws of our thinking, the laws by which we have to think nature and experience nature. And nature has to conform to these laws of our thinking, because if it didn't, we simply couldn't think it. It simply wouldn't be there for us. It simply wouldn't appear to us. Once again, the conditions of the possibility of experience, so of experiencing nature, are akin to the conditions of the possibility of the objects of experience, that is, of nature. All the laws of nature are in the end about relations. They are the laws of connection between the things. So, for example, gravity, the Earth pulling an object towards it. How is the Earth connected to that object? The laws of nature are not about the things as they are in themselves. They are about the connections between the things. But all connections, Kant points out, and I will talk more about that in future lectures, all connections come from our intellect. They are not the way things really are connected in themselves, but they are the way in which they appear to be connected, because we connect them that way, and they couldn't appear to us in any other way except connected in these ways. And with that, everything becomes clear. There are laws of nature, not because nature in itself has laws, but because we can only experience nature as conforming to those laws. And we can observe and research and understand the laws of nature precisely because they are not something strange and alien to us, but because they are the laws of our own intellect. So once again, it turns out that the old know thyself is a much deeper statement than we thought. We only know ourselves. We can't know anything else but ourselves. And even when we observe something which seems to be not ourselves, like nature, since we are just observing something that appears, and that is always something that appears to ourselves, we really are observing ourselves. And Kant says, the intellect takes its laws a priori, not from nature, but it dictates them to nature. And if that quote, the intellect dictating laws to nature, if that sounds wrong to you, or even outright crazy, if you think, what is Kant thinking and who does he think we are, that we could possibly dictate laws to nature? Does he think we are gods or what? Then that would only show that you still haven't gotten transcendental idealism. Because that would show that you still think nature is a thing in itself. And of course, if nature exists in itself, independently of us, it would be preposterous to claim that we, tiny human beings, tiny parts of nature, that we can actually dictate nature its laws, as if we had some magical or even divine powers. But remember that nature is not a thing in itself. Nature is an appearance. We can dictate laws to it, because if it doesn't conform to those laws, we can dictate laws to it, because if it doesn't conform to those laws, it simply doesn't appear to us. So if an astronaut was to take a spaceship to a far, far away planet that no one has seen before, he couldn't be sure what awaits him there. Maybe he would see things in shapes that don't exist here on Earth, that no one has seen before. Maybe he would find strange animals that no one has seen before, making noises that no one has heard before. But one thing, for example, that he could be sure about is that whatever he may find on that planet will be three-dimensional. Those animals will probably not be 2D animals or 18D animals. They will be three-dimensional. And he may see three-dimensional shapes that he never saw before, but still three-dimensional shapes to which regular geometry could be applied. He can be sure of that because space, three-dimensional space, is a condition of the possibility of experience. So you can be sure that everything which is not a three-dimensional object, like God or the soul, simply cannot be perceived by us. And also I want to point out that when Kant says that our intellect dictates laws to nature, he's of course not saying that this is arbitrary and that this is the individual dictating laws. It is the general human intellect that we all share dictating these laws, and it's not like I as an individual could just change the laws. Kant is not saying that when I hold a pencil in my hand, I can just will it to become a spoon suddenly. I cannot will the laws of nature to suddenly change. Of course not. Precisely because they are the laws of my own intellect. And I can't change that because that would mean giving myself a new intellect, changing the very way I am thinking and perceiving the world. That would essentially mean turning myself into another creature, which I can't do. It is Kant's great insight that our intellect can only really understand itself and its own products. That is why mathematics works, because mathematics is a product of our own intellect. And that is why natural science works, because we are not just observing a nature that exists independently and is governed by laws that exist independently of us here, but rather we are observing nature as it appears to us and therefore as it follows the laws of our intellect. And even there, Kant points out, to truly understand it, it's usually not enough to just observe it, but rather we have to sort of recreate nature. That is, we have to do experiments. And transcendental philosophy is possible because it is looking at those very laws that govern our own thinking. Everything else, however, is not possible. A metaphysics that is transcendent, not transcendental, but transcendent, so a metaphysics that is trying to understand the things in themselves, an ontology that is trying to talk about being, about essence in itself, cosmology that is trying to talk about the world in itself, the world of the noumena, theology that is trying to talk about God, rational psychology that is trying to talk about the soul in itself, those are not possible, precisely because here we try to do the impossible and to go beyond our own intellect, to use our intellect in order to understand something which is outside of our intellect. But something that is truly and utterly strange and foreign to us can never be understood by us, precisely because it is so strange to us. It always must stay outside of our intellect. And that means that the old Greek know thyself is actually what it all comes down to. And that means that this old saying has a much, much deeper meaning than we were aware of before Kant, and than the old Greeks were probably aware of when coming up with it. All knowledge is indeed self-knowledge, because it is the self which knows. And the knowledge cannot exist independently of the self. And even when we try to know something which seems to not be ourselves, like nature, it is still something that appears. And as an appearance, it appears to a self, to ourself. So we really don't know the object really as an object completely independently from us, from the subject, but we know only how it appears to us, to the subject, because of the way we are. So understanding anything means understanding ourselves better. And whenever we try in our understanding to truly go beyond ourselves, then we are fooling ourselves. We are trying to leave our subject behind, but still we want to know something through our subject in the end. After all, we, the subject, want to know. That doesn't work. And that is Kant's great insight. Maybe this can further illustrate and prove what I said previously, that transcendental realism leads to skepticism if we think it through. If you believe nature to be a thing in itself, you must become skeptical of our ability to really understand it. And you must become skeptical if the laws of nature that we believe to be there really are there. I mean, that was exactly the position of Hume. Hume said, yeah, sure, it seems to us as if there is causality. When one billiard ball hits the other and the second one starts rolling away, it seems that there's causation there, but we can't know that. And even today, you will find that many natural scientists, when you ask them, they will more or less subscribe to the position of Hume, as if in about 250 years nothing else had been said in the history of philosophy, as if there had been no progress at all after Hume. They will probably say something like, yeah, we don't really know that there are laws of nature, we just work with them because it works for us and because it is probable after we observed something happening in a certain way thousands of times, we may assume that it will happen the same way in the future too, but we don't really know. That's what they will say. I don't believe that's their true inner belief. I mean, that's not what they believe while they are working. While they are doing their natural science, while they are being in the laboratory. Like no chemist, for example, when doing an experiment, when observing some reaction, he probably won't expect this to not conform to the law of the conservation of energy. He a priori will assume that this law will apply to his experiment. And still, it is only while these people are not doing their natural science, it is only in theoretical discussions when they are sort of speaking as philosophers without, well, being proper philosophers and having actual knowledge of philosophy, that they come to such statements. The philosophical thing would be the aufkläred thing, because Aufklärung is about self-reflection, self-criticism. The philosophical thing would be to not just say, yeah, no, there aren't really laws of nature, or at least we don't really know about them. But rather, the philosophical thing would be to recognize, wait, stop. I do, not in theory, but in practice, in the way I act, in the way I do my work, in the assumptions I do my work with, I do believe in laws of nature. So why, if, as I say, theoretically we can't prove them, why do I believe in them so strongly? Why do I act like there are laws of nature? If they ask this self-reflective question, that could be the first step on the critical way that Kant went down. And at the end of that way, you will arrive at transcendental idealism. At recognizing, yes, there are indeed laws of nature, but not laws of nature in itself, but laws of nature as it appears to us, because they are the laws of our intellect. I don't want to conclude this long and difficult lecture without having addressed the term Copernican Revolution, because Kant's critical philosophy and his transcendental idealism has been characterized, including already by himself in the preface to the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, has been characterized as a Copernican revolution. And the question is, what is meant by that? And we can understand this, first of all, superficially in a purely formal way. That is, we can say that both Copernicus and Kant revolutionized their respective fields and led to a great paradigm shift. And we can say that both of them laid the foundations for their fields to become proper sciences. But then we can also go a bit deeper at comparing the two revolutions, and we can see that there's also a material similarity between Kant's turn in philosophy and Copernicus's turn in astronomy. To say it with Nietzsche, Copernicus was one of the greatest victors over what seems to be true to our eyes. For centuries and millennia, people looked into the sky, and with their eyes they saw the sun moving across the sky. And Copernicus basically told them, well, your eyes are deceiving you. What seems to be the case to your eyes is not actually the case. The sun is not moving around the earth. The earth is moving around the sun. And in the same way, for centuries and millennia, people looked at the world around them and basically said, this is the world. This is the thing in itself. And Kant, with his transcendental idealism, is basically telling them, no, your eyes deceive you. What seems to be true to you is not actually the case. This is just the world as it appears. This is not the thing in itself. And if you think about it, this is exactly what science always does and is supposed to do. Science is about going deeper. not stopping at what seems to be the case at first glance, but rather investigating and inquiring further to find out the truth that may actually contradict what our eyes see. So in biology, I may think that a whale is a fish. It swims in the water. It's a fish. But then the biologist tells me, no, actually it's a mammal. It is not a fish. And that's why I find it so absurd to the highest degree, but also very telling when certain people dismiss philosophy, dismiss Kant, dismiss transcendental idealism, saying that this is all humbug, this is against their common sense. And by certain people, I mean specifically those people who nowadays claim to be especially scientific and especially rational. You know, these types who claim to be these enlightened atheists, these disciples of science, these materialists who not just dismiss religion, but also any sort of philosophy of metaphysics. They claim to be scientific, but then they end up saying, no, Kant's transcendental idealism, that's completely against my common sense. My common sense tells me that these things I'm surrounded by, they are not just appearances, they are the things in itself. Common sense is the very opposite of science. When you don't go deeper, when you don't inquire further, but rather you just dig your heels into the ground and just say, no, my common sense tells me this is the truth, period. We are done with it. I refuse to look at this further. You are not being scientific. You are being an enemy of science. And if we did this in other fields, then we would not have any science. Once again, common sense tells me a whale is a fish. It clearly seems to be a fish. That was common sense for people for the longest time. If common sense is this magical ability to just instinctively know the truth, or in other words, if the truth is just what seems to be true at the first glance, then we need no science. And I ask these people, does your science conform to common sense? I mean, think of modern physics. It has nothing whatsoever to do with common sense. If you look at atom physics, or even more so at quantum physics, it completely goes against our common sense. But that's exactly the point. That's what we have science for, because our common sense does not magically give us the truth. We need to dig deeper. And we find in all the fields, not just when it comes to transcendental philosophy, but also when it comes to physics, we find that the deeper we go, the further we move away from common sense and from what seems to be true to our eyes. That's nothing specific to Kant. Rather, let me say something which really should be common sense if you think about it. And that is, if you want to understand the things, and therefore you go beyond or beneath the things, then it should be common sense that you will leave the things behind. Whatever you will arrive at, whether it's quantum physics or whether it's transcendental idealism or whatever, will go far beyond the things precisely because it is meant to explain the things. Now, if we do this material comparison between Kant and Copernicus, we can of course also see that there seems to be a difference between their two respective turns. And that is, before Copernicus, the human being was thought to be at the center of the universe, and the Copernican turn was about putting him at the periphery, saying, no, we are not the center, we are looking at the center, the sun is the center, from the outside. While what Kant is doing is the exact opposite. Before, in philosophy, since Thales or Aristotle, all the way up to Kant, we believe to be at the periphery. We thought of ourselves as things among things, mere observers on the sideline, observing the world as it is, trying to find out more about the world as it is. And now, with Kant's transcendental idealism, we find that we are in a way the very center of the world, and the whole world revolves around us because we, after all, are the ones to whom this world appears. But if you look at this from another side, you may find that actually Copernicus and Kant aren't so different in this either. Because you could say that both found themselves confronted with certain problems. Both found themselves in the face of a certain phenomenon which they wanted to explain. And both ended up explaining it by reflecting on themselves, reflecting on their own role in this phenomenon. They both stopped treating it as something which simply is there independently of us and now it needs to be explained how it can be there, but rather they both realized, wait, it is there for me. Maybe it is my subjective perspective which makes it appear in this way. Maybe I, as the observer, have an influence on the observed, not on how it is in itself, but on how it appears to me. And with this, both Copernicus and Kant turn out to be part of a broader development and progress in the history of the spirit. If we look back to the very first philosophers and the very first natural scientists, and they were the same people really, they looked at the world as a thing in itself and tried to better understand the world, asking what is the world made up of? Is the world water? Is the world made up of 4 elements? Is the world number? Is the world coming from the ideas? They didn't really take the human being as the observer of the world into account. In the days of Socrates, you have the sophist Protagoras saying the human being is the measure of all things. And that's a statement which can already be interpreted as perfectly transcendental idealistic statement. That's not to say that Protagoras meant it in that way necessarily. But as I talked about in the lecture on how to read texts according to Kant, you should try to understand an author better than he understood himself. And you should not just ask what did he consciously mean by what he said, but rather what did reason mean by it? What should he have meant? And in that sense, you could say the statement of Protagoras is correct if you interpreted it as transcendental idealism. And in the same time, with Socrates, you can see a shift towards the individual. First, a shift not so much in theoretical philosophy, but rather in practical philosophy. So the individual action and the individual responsibility of the individual person, of the I, is becoming the center of ethics. And this is something that only becomes more prominent with Christism, which put a lot of emphasis on the individual human being. You're sinning, you're accepting Jesus and thereby gaining entrance into heaven. That suddenly was what mattered. And then again, you had the Protestant Reformation. And I consider it no coincidence that sometime later Aufklärung happened in the Protestant regions, like northern Germany. And that all the Aufklärers came, like Kant himself, came from a Protestant background. That's not to say that the Reformation itself or Luther himself was already aufklärt or an Aufklärer, but still it was another push in that direction, because now what was being said is you can't just delegate your religiosity to some sort of priesthood, to some sort of church. You can't just let the Pope and the bishops be religious for you. Rather, if you want to get on God's good side, if you want to get into heaven, you yourself need to be pious and religious. And now there was this concept of the freedom of conscience. You yourself had to decide what to believe in, what you believed was true. You can't just blindly swallow whatever the Pope and his church tell you, but rather you yourself should read the Bible. That's why the Protestants ended up translating the Bible into the common language of the common people. And you yourself should find whatever is true in the Bible. And since the advent of modernity, since the Reformation and also humanism, more and more put the subject at the center, we can find that all our science more and more understood the role of the subject and the subject's perspective in the way the world appears to us. So in the natural science, you have Copernicus realizing that the sun only appears to move around the earth because of our perspective. And you can go all the way to the current day and to, for example, the uncertainty relation, that is to physicists realizing that the observer plays a crucial part in what there even is to be observed. And a similar movement can be seen in what is called the humanities or the social sciences or the sciences of spirit in German. That is, we find that things we probably previously thought to be to necessarily be the way they are. Our values, our roles, our very feelings, how we deal with important parts of life like childhood, death, sexuality. All these things are not set in stone. We more and more realize there is not simply a thing such as the childhood or the sexuality or certain feelings such as love or sadness or depression or whatever. And we don't just observe and perceive them as they are in themselves and then deal with them one way or another, but rather we sort of make them. By the way we deal with them, we make them in a certain way. More and more we have realized that things like, for example, gender and gender roles are social constructs. You almost can't say that anymore because a term like that has been misused and abused and become politicized so much. But this is something we more and more came to realize. By we, I mean the thinking people, I mean science, not necessarily everyone. But even here you can see that it is especially the unaufkläred people, or even the anti-aufkläred people, the fascists, who oppose this the most. They don't want to hear this. They don't want something like gender to be a social construct. They want it to be a thing in itself, something that is set in stone and that we just happen to observe, but certainly not to create. And why do they want that? Precisely because they are anti-Aufklärers. Because they don't want the individual to matter. They don't want the individual to be free and to have responsibility. If we are just, as Locke said, a tabula rasa, an empty table, and so to say, nature writes itself into our mind by us making experience. If we just experience nature as it is, then we are not responsible for it. Then we can try to deal with it in certain ways, but we are victims of nature. Nature simply is as it is. We haven't made it that way. But once we realize how much of what we think of as our reality, whether it's our social reality, our emotional reality, but even our physical reality, once we realize how much of that is actually dependent on our intellect, that is, on the form we choose to give to reality, on the connections we draw between the raw material that is given to us, we realize more and more our freedom. We realize more and more that we are perpetrators and not just victims. We realize more and more our responsibility. Because if things depend on our perspective, then there is the question if maybe we can assume a different perspective and if maybe we ought to assume a different perspective. And that is something that many unaufkläred people don't want to hear, because they always flee and run away from their responsibility. And that is why they often react with ridicule or even with violent attacks to someone telling them how much depends on their own intellect, on their own way of viewing reality. But this was important for me to point out, that Kant, for one, is not so singular or so different from everything else as it may seem at first. Rather, he's only the culmination and the highest point of a general history of human development. And at the same time, that this development is an aufklärt one. Because Aufklärung, as I have said previously, Aufklärung is mainly about self-reflection, about looking critically at myself and realizing that I'm not a passive victim, but an active perpetrator who is actively responsible. Or, as my father once put it, critical philosophy is, in short, what is the human being doing and whom is he accusing instead of taking care of his own action. Transcendental idealism means realizing that almost everything in the world, even the substantiality, the causality, the possibility, are our own concepts, or even time and space, our own forms of viewing the things. Transcendental idealism means realizing that only the raw material, the sensual perceptions, come to us and are received by us, but everything else, that is the form, the way things are connected, is actually made by us, by our activity. And even most of the things that we falsely believe to be mere sensations or mere perceptions, like for example causality, most people would believe they perceive causality, but they don't perceive it. We don't perceive A causing B. We only perceive A happening and then B happening. So the connection between A and B is not something we can possibly perceive. It is something we make, something we think. And so therefore, transcendental idealism, which realizes this, is Aufklärung in its purest sense. And it is the only possible worldview of Aufklärung. And if you are an aufkläred person, you will become a transcendental idealist. I hope that with this lecture I could give a general overview over what that means and a general sense of what it means. I will stress once again that no one truly understands it the first time. So watch the lecture again. Watch other stuff about transcendental idealism, like, for example, my upcoming lectures in which I will go into more detail of Kant's system and his whole epistemology, that is his whole theory of cognition, or read about it. Don't be discouraged if you don't understand it at first. Give it time, but time alone will not be enough. You can't just be passive in this and understand it if you've just heard it enough times, but you need to be active. You need to actually do this Copernican turn, to turn around, to self-reflect and to realize that something which maybe previously you believed to just be a fact, just be reality, is in fact a result of your perspective, a result of your thinking. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Deuringer, Garnau Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Samet Özkilic, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufklärung course.